Good afternoon. I have the pleasure of introducing Robbert Dijkgraaf, who is the director of the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. And he will be speaking about the usefulness of useless knowledge. That's it. Robbert, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to speak here. My name is Robbert Dijkgraaf. I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, which is a famous institution, if only because the first professor there was Albert Einstein. I like to say after that we had 85 years of steady decline. But I'm also talking about an essay, The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge, that actually was written by the first director, Abraham Flexner, and it appeared in 1939. And of course we have been discussing today that the world is kind of a troubling place, but October 1939 it was particular. And he came up with a very forceful defense of science and scholarship. And let me just read you the first paragraph. Is it not curious fact that in a world steeped in irrational hatred which threatens civilization itself, men and women, old and young, detach themselves wholly or partly from the angry current of daily life to devote themselves to the cultivation of beauty, to the extension of knowledge, to the cure of disease, to the amelioration of suffering, as though fanatics were not simultaneously engaged in spreading pain, ugliness and suffering. And here it comes. The world has always been a sorry and confused sort of place, yet poets and artists and scientists have ignored the factors that would, if intended to, paralyze them. And I think this is a very powerful message, that we shouldn't be paralyzed and should recognize the value of science. Actually, when Flexner started the institute, the first thing he did was not recruit faculty, not design a building, but ask an artist to design a logo and have a motto. And the motto was truth and beauty. And it's this, I would say we spend in the scientific community a lot of time explaining the beauty of our field. And these days I think we are again recognizing that truth is equally important. So to explain Flexner's point of view, I want to bring you back to the world of 1939. In fact, there was the World Exposition in New York, and the theme was the world of tomorrow. And it was a view into the future. And there were some tremendous interesting things to see. It was actually the first time television was introduced to the world. The opening speech by President Roosevelt was the first broadcast. There were 300 television sets in the US at that time. It was the first fax machine, the first electronic dishwasher and washing machine. And so in many ways it was a peek into the future. In fact, there was a second opening speech was given by Albert Einstein. And he was asked to talk about the future of science. And he spoke about cosmic rays, a kind of esoteric topic. In many ways, his talk was a total disaster. You know, at the moment when he finished the talk, there should be a big light show, and in fact, all the fuses blew. And the New York Times reported that the audience left for a spectacle they could applaud. But it's interesting that his speech didn't mention two things, which were nuclear physics and computers. And they would totally change the world. And in fact, they were happening right at his own place, in this very small institution that was founded in the 1930s. In fact, what happened in 1939, of course, was there was a lot of research in particle physics. And just after that opening of the World Exposition, Einstein here wrote with Szilard the famous letter to President Roosevelt that started the Manhattan Project. So very soon, that very esoteric field became very applicable. A second field that was actively pursued was mathematical logic. People like John von Neumann, Kurt Gödel, Alan Turing. And these insights in the logic of mathematical proofs led very soon to building an actual computer. Von Neumann actually in the 1940s built the first modern architectural computer at the Institute for Advanced Study. And at that time, of course, this was seen as a very esoteric subject. Remarkable thing is that this machine, which by the way only had 1,000 bits of memory, was already being applied by von Neumann to many other fields. For instance, he worked on the hydrogen bomb, and so this institution that was very small and that was meant to be devoted to pure research, pure basic research, as far removed from reality. 10 years later, we will have Albert Einstein there, who was basically the father of the peace movement. There was von Neumann actively working on the hydrogen bomb, and then there was Oppenheimer with a position in between. So science was incredibly relevant, and in some sense, also at that time in the 1950s, also a victim, because of course, as you know, Oppenheimer was very much a source and an active goal of McCarthyism. Now, the computer was used not only for military projects. At the very beginning, von Neumann saw many other applications. So actually the first computerized weather prediction were done there. And these days it actually took 48 hours to predict tomorrow's weather. So this was a very good post-diction. But then there's this remarkable thing that von Neumann is asked to write in 1955 on the theme, can we survive technology? And you might expect at the height of the Cold War this would all be about nuclear arms. It's not. In fact, a small fraction of this piece is about the arms race and the Cold War, but 3/4 is about climate change and how it could actually be, in his own words. Climate change, he says, will merge each other's nations' affair more thoroughly than the threat of nuclear war. He already realized that in some sense it could also be kind of a weapon. And then I must say I also find it very comforting that his final words are then, the problems of future humanity can be resolved not by a single prescription, but reliance on human qualities as patience, flexibility, and intelligence. So this is a little kind of insight of how basic research has this tremendous opportunity to transform societies in ways that we cannot perceive. And this is of course a long story. And Flexner gives examples. It's easy to add new examples to it. Think about electricity. Now, it started as kind of a fun game in the 1830s. There's this famous quote that might be apocryphal, but that when the British Chancellor of the Exchequer walked into Michael Faraday's laboratory and asked, what's good for? He said, I have no idea, but one day, sir, you may tax it. And of course, we did. We all pay taxes on our electricity bills. Think about quantum mechanics, which started as a field somehow in desperation. Scientists, often many very, very young, trying to, in some sense, save science. And, as Max Planck said, he was willing to make any sacrifice to the principles in physics to save science. Now it's estimated that 30% of our GDP is directly based on quantum mechanics. I would actually say 100% of reality is based on quantum mechanics. So everything we do. But this will increase very rapidly, certainly when we have quantum computers and other things. So there's been tremendous impact. In fact, there's something else which I would like to call the usefulness of useless knowledge. That not only you get wonderful applications, but then these applications itself lead to breakthrough work. Let me mention one thing, which is superconductivity, this wonderful property of materials, if you cool them down, that electricity can basically flow for free. Was discovered in the laboratory of Kamerlingh Onnes, the Nobel laureate. He was Dutch. Actually, one little anecdote, he found this by investing massively in science, by building, the first thing he did, he built a school for lab technicians that then after 10 years produced the experts that he needed to do his experiments. Now we know we have many applications, of course, anything that has to do with maglev trains. In fact, the very strong magnets you build can be used for fMRI scans, and so they actually led to the whole world of neuroscience. Modern neuroscience cannot be perceived without that discovery. And in fact, quantum computers also plays a crucial role. But perhaps the biggest application is again in fundamental science. So the coldest spot on the planet, and perhaps in the universe, is actually the Large Hadron Collider in CERN, where these very cold magnets are being used to run the particle accelerator. And so the discovery of the Higgs particle can be seen as an immediate consequence of this other fundamental idea that appeared 100 years before. A century is not a reasonable long amount of time for a discovery to see the impact. A very beautiful result is this year's Nobel Prize in Physics, which recognizes gravitational waves, something that Einstein predicted more than 100 years before. The fact that you all find your way here is probably through GPS. And as you know, GPS wouldn't work, would be several kilometers off each day if you didn't apply Einstein's special and general theory of relativity. I like to say without Einstein, we would all be lost. But you know, if you think about the useful basic research, it's interesting to see this. I have this meandering river because it flows in many directions. Clearly, knowledge is important in and of itself. But also it has these kind of secondary effects. These transformative ideas and technologies change our society. They develop new tools and techniques. When particle physicists had to collaborate worldwide, they actually created the World Wide Web as a kind of a social experiment. And we all benefited from that. We attract the best minds in science, who then actually, many of them, go into society and transform it in other possible ways. It drives innovation and startups in a very spectacular way. And I think it's truly a public good. I think one reason why we need the science and why it needs to be publicly supported, that no company, no individual, no country, no university can capture the goods, all of it. It's really something that spreads across boundaries. It's also something worthwhile. The European Commission just recently calculated an investment in science drives our well-being with factors from 5 to 7. The most famous examples here for MIT, it claims it created 30,000 companies with almost 5 million employees. So there's a real also practical argument to, I would say, invest in basic science, to invest in truth. And the most spectacular example is this small grant of $4.5 million that was given to Stanford University to develop a search algorithm on the internet. Now, and of course, it led to the creation of Google. So if you see the multiplier, if you think of this as an investment, it's an investment of a factor of more than 100,000. Some people make the idea that, you know, we could have 99,999 government grants that would have failed and still would have come out positively. On the other hand, we see that the investments in basic research are declining. More and more is put on the level of universities, and we see companies retracting from that. Now, I want to kind of end by saying something about what drives this search for truth, and I want to go back to Flexner. And he writes that it's the underlying thing is curiosity. Curiosity that may or may not eventuate as something useful. And I like to quote here Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, who said that, you know, you have to know what's on the other side of the hill. We're talking about truth here, but truth is always evolving. And some people are able to see things that others do not see. In some sense, I think, you know, imagination is the way to peer through the walls. And curiosity is the innate human urge to climb over the wall and see what's out there. What is the next step? And I think the imagination is an incredibly important thing. And I want to end with this little anecdote. This is Jacobus van 't Hoff. He actually was the first Nobel laureate in chemistry. So I always like to say in 1901, the Dutch had 100% of all Nobel Prizes in chemistry. And he was the first to realize essentially that molecules are three-dimensional, that a mirror image of a molecule is not the same. When he made this discovery, when he announced himself, he was criticized. And this is from a famous German chemist. Kolbe said, well, van 't Hoff, he made really a leap of the imagination. He climbed on his flying horse Pegasus and basically went to Mount Parnassus and just declared how things were. And van 't Hoff was really touched by this criticism. And when he was finally a professor in Amsterdam, the topic of his inaugural lecture was the power of imagination. And he made a scientific study. He looked at the 200 most famous scientists of the last few hundred years and put them in three categories. Those without imagination, no interest in the arts or poetry or music. Those with imagination, who love poems, who love paintings, etc. And then there's a third category, in his words, those with pervert amount of imagination. Those who liked astrology, all kind of crazy stuff. And these are the people who are in there. That's Newton, Leibniz, Descartes, etc. And he makes the point that if you have this urge to discover the truth, you might be over-ambitious and might go to certain areas where others will not go. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind. That it's not only this symposium is about truth, but it's also about the mechanism, the scientific method, but also the urge to find truth. And I think that we want to convey in the same way as we want to convey the products of science. I want to kind of finish with Einstein. A quote of Einstein. This is all this wonderful anecdote that's often told that when he was a young boy, he got a compass. And the compass, like everybody, every child, is amazed that the needle always pointed north. But then he describes that he walked with the compass to the room. And he discovered something else. There was a force, pervasive force through the whole room, which kept the compass needle pointing north. And in some sense, this is the discovery of the magnetic field. And it's beautiful because his whole world and work is about fields, etc. But also it shows us the imagination of a child. And I want to finish by this wonderful quote, that's one of my favorites of Einstein, he had many, that imagination is more important than knowledge. Because knowledge is limited to all we know and understand, while imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution. I would say imagination is the place where you really find the future of truth. Thank you very much.